For centuries, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain lived in relative peace, their monasteries untouched, their towns growing, their rulers focused on rivalries within their own land. But then everything changed. From the far north, across the cold and violent sea, came a force unlike any the English had ever seen. The year was 793 AD, and Britain was about to enter an age of war, fire, and steel. When the first Norse longships landed at Lindisfarne, they brought more than just war. They brought terror, they brought an unstoppable tide of warriors, ready to carve out their own kingdoms in foreign lands. The Anglo-Saxon world would never be the same again. The Viking Age had begun. For centuries, history books have told the story of Viking raids as little more than plunder and destruction, a wave of mindless violence that eventually faded away. But is that really the whole story? What if I told you that the Vikings weren't just raiders, that they weren't just plunderers, that is what they really wanted, was something far greater? Because the truth is, these Norse warriors didn't just come to burn monasteries and sail away. They came to stay, they came to rule, they came to reshape Britain itself. We will not sell nonsense in this video. We study these topics in depth to provide as much serious historical knowledge as possible. Neil Price, leading historian for Vikings history in his best-selling book, Children of Ash and Elm, writes, "The Vikings did not simply arrive, they transformed. They imposed their rule, reshaped the landscape, and left a legacy that echoes into the modern world." Their impact wasn't just felt in battle, but in law, language, and culture. The very foundation of what would become England was shaped, in part, by these Norse invaders. So how did they do it? How did a scattered force of warriors evolve into rulers of vast territories, carving out entire kingdoms within England? And how did the Anglo-Saxon world fight back? This is the story of the Viking invasions, a tale of blood and steel, of kings and warlords, of survival and transformation. And by the end of this video, you will see why the Vikings were far more than just raiders. Welcome to part 2 of our series on the Viking invasions of England. In this episode, we continue the epic story of how Norse warriors clashed with Anglo-Saxon kings, from the arrival of the Great Heathen Army to the rise of Alfred the Great and the creation of the Danelaw. If you missed part 1, we strongly recommend watching it first. It covers the dramatic beginning of the Viking Age in Britain, including the legendary raid on Lindisfarne, early Norse strategies, and the fragile response of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Click the link in the description below to watch part 1 and follow the full journey from the very beginning of the storm from the north. In the final months of 865 AD, a fleet of hundreds of longships appeared off the eastern coast of England. These were not the small raiding parties that had terrorized Anglo-Saxon England for nearly a century. This was something altogether different, a massive, organized force of Viking warriors, known to history as the Great Heathen Army, Mysel here in Old English. For decades, the Anglo-Saxons had struggled to deal with the Viking menace. Each summer, swift Norse warbands would descend upon their shores, attacking monasteries, villages, and towns. These incursions were devastating, but they were at least predictable. The Vikings would raid for a season, collect their plunder, and return home before winter. But this new force did not arrive to plunder and retreat. It had come to conquer and stay. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, describes the moment with chilling clarity. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army marked a transition in Viking warfare. This was no longer a war of raids. It was a war of occupation. The Vikings had spent years testing England's weaknesses. Now they meant to claim it. The sheer scale of the invasion stunned contemporary chroniclers. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a record of English history kept by monks, described the fleet in ominous terms. a great host of heathen men came to the land of the English and took winter quarters among them, seeking to overthrow the land and rule it as their own. Unlike previous Viking expeditions, this was a cohesive, well-planned military campaign. It had clear leadership, strategic objectives, and an army large enough to challenge entire kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxons, still divided among rival rulers, had no idea how to respond. The exact size of the Great Heathen Army is unknown. Later medieval sources, such as the 12th century historian Simeon of Durham, claimed it numbered tens of thousands. Modern historians, however, estimate that the initial force may have consisted of between 3,000 and 5,000 warriors, though reinforcements would arrive in the following years. What made this army particularly dangerous was the experience of its warriors. Many of these Vikings were battle-hardened veterans who had fought for decades across Europe. Vikings from Denmark, Norway and Sweden had spent years in Francia, fighting under and against the Carolingians. Others had fought in Ireland, where Viking strongholds, like Dublin, Waterford and Limerick, had been established as powerful Norse trading hubs. Many had served as mercenaries in Byzantine lands, fighting in the infamous Varangian Guard. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, notes, "By the time the Great Heathen Army landed in England, the warriors who made up its ranks were among the most experienced fighters in Europe. They had learned from every battlefield, every siege, and every campaign. The Anglo-Saxons had never faced anything like them. These men were not simple plunderers. They were seasoned warriors, skilled in siege warfare, organized battle tactics, and strategic campaigning." Most Anglo-Saxon armies at the time consisted of local militias, known as the fyrd, farmers and landowners who were called up in times of war. They were not professional soldiers. By contrast, the Viking warriors of the Great Heathen Army had spent their entire lives fighting. This disparity in training, organization and experience would prove catastrophic for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Historians have debated the true motivations behind the Great Heathen Army's invasion. Unlike the typical Viking raids of earlier decades, this was not a simple quest for silver and slaves. The Great Heathen Army came to seize land, establish rule, and dismantle the existing Anglo-Saxon order. Peter Sawyer in the Viking expansion outlines three key reasons why the invasion occurred. 1. The promise of land and power. Scandinavia, particularly Denmark and Norway, was experiencing political turmoil in the mid-9th century. Ambitious warlords and younger sons of noble families saw England as a land of opportunity, a place where they could carve out their own kingdoms. Rather than returning home to fight for scraps, many Viking leaders sought to conquer new lands and establish their own rule. The weakened state of Anglo-Saxon England. By the 860s, England was divided into four main kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia. These kingdoms were constantly at war with one another, creating a perfect opportunity for an invading force to exploit their rivalries. Unlike the Franks, who had begun to fortify their cities and coasts, the Anglo-Saxons were still unprepared for sustained Viking aggression. The legacy of Ragnar Lothbrok, as told in the sagas, Norse sagas, written centuries later, claim that the Great Heathen Army invaded to avenge the legendary Viking hero Ragnar Lothbrok, who had supposedly been captured and executed by King Ella of Northumbria. This story, though likely a later embellishment, reflects the Norse cultural emphasis on vengeance and honor. Even if the tale of Ragnar's execution was invented, the idea that Viking leaders sought to punish the Anglo-Saxons and claim England as their own was very real. Gareth Williams in Viking Britain adds, "Whether or not the Great Heathen Army truly came for revenge, their actions were the same. They sought to dismantle the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and reshape England in their own image." After landing in East Anglia, the Vikings didn't immediately begin their conquest. Instead, they did something unexpected. They negotiated. King Edmund of East Anglia, realizing he was outnumbered, chose to supply the Vikings with horses instead of fighting them. This decision allowed the Great Heathen Army to become fully mobile, enabling them to launch rapid campaigns across England. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, describes this turning point. It was a fateful mistake. By granting the Vikings access to the greatest weapon of the Anglo-Saxon nobility, the horse, King Edmund had sealed England's fate. What had once been an army of sea-borne raiders became a cavalry force capable of devastating entire kingdoms. With horses, experienced leadership, and a divided enemy, the Great Heathen Army was poised to reshape England forever. Their next target? Northumbria and the great city of York. The Great Heathen Army was not a disorganized mass of warriors, nor was it a single unified force. It was a coalition of warbands, a gathering of powerful Viking leaders who had carved out their reputations across the battlefields of Europe. Each of these leaders had their own ambitions, their own rivalries, and their own visions of conquest. Unlike previous Viking raids, where chieftains led independent warbands for quick profit, the Great Heathen Army was led by a council of warlords, some of whom would go on to shape the future of England itself. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, "The leaders of the Great Heathen Army were not mere raiders. They were kings in the making, warriors who had outgrown the small-scale ambitions of their predecessors. They saw England not just as a prize, but as a land to rule." To understand the unprecedented success of the Viking invasion, we must first understand the men who led it. If there was one name that terrified the Anglo-Saxons more than any other in the late 9th century, it was Ivar the Boneless. His legend is shrouded in mystery, but all sources, both Norse and Anglo-Saxon, agree on one thing: he was a strategist without equal. The enigma of his name. What did boneless mean? Historians have long debated the meaning of Ivar's epithet, boneless, hinbeinlausi in Old Norse. Medical condition theory. Some scholars believe Ivar may have suffered from a genetic disorder, such as osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease, or another condition that made him physically weak. Serpent imagery theory. Others suggest that boneless was a symbolic title, possibly referring to his serpent-like movements in battle or his ability to slip through enemy lines unseen. Fear and propaganda theory. Another theory is that the title was a psychological weapon, a deliberate choice to strike fear into enemies, much like Viking war banners depicting monstrous beasts. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, argues that Ivar the Boneless is one of the most elusive figures of the Viking Age. Whether his condition was physical or metaphorical, he was undeniably a man of immense intelligence and ambition. Despite the mystery surrounding his name, one thing is clear: Ivar was a military genius. Unlike other Viking warlords who relied on brute force, Ivar used strategy, deception, and psychological terror. He was known for luring enemies into traps, forcing them into narrow passages or marshy terrain where their numbers meant nothing. He spread fear before battle, using fire, brutality, and calculated intimidation to break enemy morale before the first sword was drawn. He was patient, choosing his battles carefully rather than fighting for the sake of glory. Peter Sawyer in the Viking expansion describes Ivar's methods. Where others saw war as a contest of strength, Ivar saw it as a game of the mind. His victories were often won before the battle even began. But Ivar was not the only leader of the Great Heathen Army. Beside him stood warriors just as dangerous in their own ways. If Ivar was the strategist, his brother Halfdan was the conqueror. Unlike Ivar, who preferred tactics and patience, Halfdan was a warrior through and through, a man who thrived in the chaos of battle. He led the direct assaults on Anglo-Saxon strongholds, leading from the front rather than the shadows. He was one of the first Viking rulers of Northumbria, seizing control of York and establishing a permanent Viking presence in the north. He was ambitious, aiming not just to raid but to rule. Gareth Williams in Viking Britain describes Halfdan's impact. Where Ivar was careful, Halfdan was relentless. He understood that the key to Viking rule in England was not just plundering it, but controlling it. Halfdan's brutality and ambition would make him one of the first true Viking kings of England. Ubba was another brother of Ivar, though he is often overshadowed by his more famous siblings. However, contemporary sources suggest that he was one of the most feared Viking warlords of the invasion. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle mentions him specifically as a great Viking leader, suggesting that even among the Norse he stood out. He played a major role in the invasion of Wessex, leading Viking armies in battles against Alfred the Great. He was known for his ferocity in battle, embodying the warrior spirit that the Vikings idolized. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, describes Ubba as a leader whose strength lay in his ability to inspire fear. Where he led, men followed, not because of loyalty, but because of terror. Ubba's fate would be sealed in the wars against Wessex, but before his end, he would strike at the heart of Anglo-Saxon resistance. While Guthrum was not one of the original leaders of the Great Heathen Army, he rose to power as one of its most significant commanders. Unlike Ivar, Halfdan, or Ubba, Guthrum was a long-term strategist, focusing not just on battles, but on the governance of Viking-controlled lands. He would go on to lead the last great push against Wessex, bringing the Anglo-Saxon world to its knees. His later defeat by Alfred the Great at the Battle of Edington would mark the turning point in the Viking Wars in England. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking expansion, describes Guthrum as a warlord with the mind of a king. He was not content with conquest, he wanted to rule. Guthrum's legacy would extend beyond the battlefield, shaping the Danelaw and the integration of Viking rule in England. The leaders of the Great Heathen Army were not ordinary Vikings. They were men of vision, ambition, and terrifying skill in warfare. Ivar the Boneless was the strategist, the master of deception. Halfdan was the conqueror, the first Viking king of Northumbria. Ubba was the warrior, feared by both Viking and Anglo-Saxon alike. Guthrum was the ruler, the man who sought to hold what others had won. Together, these men rewrote the history of England, setting the stage for the wars that would define the next century. The arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 AD did not immediately lead to a devastating war. Instead, its first campaign was almost bloodless, a sign that the Anglo-Saxon rulers were woefully unprepared for what was to come. As the Viking force landed on the shores of East Anglia, its leaders, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, faced little resistance. The kingdom's ruler, King Edmund of East Anglia, was no fool. He had seen what the Vikings had done to other regions of England, and he knew that his forces were too weak to oppose them in open battle. Rather than risk complete destruction, Edmund chose diplomacy over war. He offered the Vikings horses, supplies, and treasure in exchange for peace. For the time being, Ivar and his warlords accepted the offer. But the Vikings had no intention of staying in East Anglia. Their real target lay to the north, where the kingdom of Northumbria was in the middle of a bloody civil war. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, describes this moment. King Edmund's decision to submit without a fight may have spared East Anglia from immediate destruction, but it also set a dangerous precedent. The Vikings now knew that the Anglo-Saxon rulers could be cowed, that their kingdoms were divided, and that fear was as effective a weapon as the sword. With fresh horses and a well-fed army, the Great Heathen Army turned toward Northumbria, where a fractured kingdom awaited its doom. Of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Northumbria should have been the hardest to conquer. It was one of the largest and most powerful realms in England, home to the famous city of York, Jorvik. But in 866 AD, when the Great Heathen Army arrived at its gates, Northumbria was already tearing itself apart. A brutal civil war had erupted between two rival kings, Ella and Osbert, both of whom claimed the throne. Their armies were locked in battle, their nobles divided. It was the perfect opportunity for the Vikings to strike. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking expansion, explains, "The Northumbrians, blinded by their own internal conflicts, failed to see the true danger that approached from the south. The Vikings were not just another faction in their civil war, they were an existential threat." In autumn of 866, Ivar and Halfdan marched north with their army, advancing rapidly with their new East Anglian horses. They arrived at the gates of York before the Northumbrians could react, taking the city almost unopposed. For 5 months, the Vikings fortified their hold over York, preparing for the inevitable counterattack. In March 867, Kings Ella and Osbert finally realized the danger they faced. They set aside their differences and led a combined force against the Vikings, hoping to retake their city. It was a disaster. The Northumbrians attacked head-on, trying to force their way into York. But Ivar, a master of tactics, had anticipated their move. He allowed them to push into the city's narrow streets, only to trap them inside, cutting off their retreat. The Northumbrian army was slaughtered and both kings were killed in the battle. But Ella's death was no ordinary battlefield casualty. According to Norse sagas, Ivar had a personal reason for wanting him dead. The saga of Ragnar Lothbrok claims that Ella had once captured and executed Ivar's father, Ragnar Lothbrok, by throwing him into a pit of snakes. Now, Ivar took his revenge, the Blood Eagle. According to Norse tradition, Ivar ordered that Ella be executed by Blood Eagle, a horrifying method of execution in which the victim's ribs were cut open from the back and pulled outward like wings, while their lungs were ripped out of their body. Whether this actually happened is debated by historians, as the only sources for it come from later medieval sagas. However, what is undeniable is that Northumbria fell that day. The kingdom was now under Viking control, and York became the first major Viking stronghold in England. Timothy Bolton in The Empire of Canute the Great writes, "With the capture of York, the Great Heathen Army had done what no Viking force before them had achieved. They had taken an entire Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and they were only getting started." With Northumbria crushed, the Great Heathen Army turned its sights southward. The next major kingdom in their path was Mercia, the second largest Anglo-Saxon realm after Wessex. In 868 AD, the Vikings advanced into Mercia, seizing control of Nottingham. King Burgred of Mercia, desperate for help, called upon King Ethelred of Wessex and his brother Alfred, later Alfred the Great, to intervene. The combined Mercian and Wessex forces marched on Nottingham, but instead of fighting, Burgred chose to negotiate peace, paying the Vikings a large tribute to leave Mercia alone. This bought time, but it did not stop the Viking advance. Instead, the Great Heathen Army now turned its wrath toward the kingdom that had humiliated them in 865, East Anglia. In 869 AD, the Vikings returned to East Anglia, where King Edmund now refused to submit. The East Anglian army attempted to resist, but they were swiftly crushed. Edmund himself was captured, and his fate became one of the most famous martyrdom stories in English history. According to later accounts, Edmund was tied to a tree, shot with arrows until his body was pierced like a porcupine, then beheaded. His severed head was said to have been guarded by a wolf, leading to the later legend of Saint Edmund, the patron saint of England. Eleanor Parker in Dragonlords explains, "The execution of Edmund was meant to send a message. This was not a simple raid. This was a conquest. The old kings would either bow to the Norse or they would die." By the dawn of 870 AD, the Great Heathen Army had annihilated two Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Northumbria was under Viking rule, with York as their capital. East Anglia had been crushed, its king executed in brutal fashion. Mercia had submitted, paying tribute rather than fighting. Only one kingdom remained truly free: Wessex. The war for England was now a war for survival, and the fate of the Anglo-Saxon world rested in the hands of one young leader, Alfred of Wessex. By the beginning of 871 AD, the Great Heathen Army had achieved what no Viking force had done before. In just 5 years, they had dismantled the political order of Anglo-Saxon England. Northumbria had fallen. York was now a Viking city. East Anglia had been crushed, its king Edmund brutally executed. Mercia had been weakened and forced to submit, its king choosing to pay tribute rather than resist. The only kingdom left standing was Wessex, the ancestral homeland of the West Saxons. Unlike the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex was wealthier, better organized, and had a stronger military tradition. Its rulers had been watching the Viking conquest unfold with growing unease. But now the storm had reached their borders. The final test of the Anglo-Saxons had begun. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, "By 871, it was clear that the Viking warlords intended to take all of England, but they had not yet faced Wessex, and Wessex would prove to be their greatest challenge." The king of Wessex at this time was Ethelred, a capable but beleaguered ruler, constantly forced to defend his land against the relentless Viking onslaught. At his side stood his younger brother, Alfred, a warrior scholar who would later be remembered as Alfred the Great. The war that followed would define the future of England. The Vikings did not wait long to strike. In January 871, they launched a full-scale invasion of Wessex, hoping to eliminate the last remaining Anglo-Saxon stronghold. What followed was one of the most brutal years in English history, the Year of 9 Battles. The first major clash came at Reading, where the Great Heathen Army, now reinforced by fresh warriors from across the North Sea, established a stronghold. King Ethelred and Prince Alfred marched toward Reading, determined to drive the invaders back, but when they attacked, they were met with a devastating counter-offensive. The Vikings had fortified their position, turning the town into an improvised fortress. The Anglo-Saxons were unable to break through the defensive lines, suffering heavy casualties. Ethelred and Alfred were forced to retreat, leaving the Vikings in control of the battlefield. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, notes, "The Battle of Reading was a harsh lesson for Wessex. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were organized, disciplined, and fully capable of holding territory." After the defeat at Reading, it seemed as if Wessex would fall like the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. But just days later, the tide of war changed. The Battle of Ashdown, 8th January 871 AD, a moment of hope. 4 days after the defeat at Reading, the Anglo-Saxons regrouped. King Ethelred and Alfred mustered a second army and confronted the Vikings at Ashdown, a wind-swept ridge in the Berkshire Downs. According to later sources, as the battle began, King Ethelred refused to leave his tent, insisting on finishing his prayers before taking command. This left Alfred to lead the army alone. Rather than waiting, Alfred took a bold gamble. He ordered an immediate attack, leading his warriors into battle before his brother had even joined them. The West Saxons charged uphill, smashing into the Viking shield wall. Alfred's warriors fought with desperate ferocity, determined to avenge their earlier defeat. After hours of brutal combat, the Viking lines began to waver, and finally they broke and fled. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this as a decisive victory, stating, "The heathens were put to flight and we held the field." Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, describes Ashdown as a turning point in the war. For the first time, the West Saxons proved that the Vikings were not invincible, but one victory would not be enough. Despite the triumph at Ashdown, Wessex's struggles were far from over. Over the next few months, the Vikings launched relentless counterattacks, and the Anglo-Saxons suffered devastating losses. In March 871, the Battle of Meryton ended in another crushing Viking victory. King Ethelred was mortally wounded, leaving Wessex without a strong leader. Alfred, still in his early 20s, was suddenly thrust into the kingship of a nation on the verge of collapse. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, writes, "Alfred's ascension came at the worst possible moment. He inherited a kingdom that was exhausted, leaderless, and teetering on the brink of annihilation. For the next 4 years, from 871 to 875, the war dragged on. The Vikings continued to ravage the countryside, burning towns and monasteries. Alfred struggled to keep his forces together, often resorting to guerrilla tactics to harass the enemy. The Anglo-Saxons faced constant famine and hardship as Viking warbands plundered their food supplies. The worst moment came in 875 AD, when the Viking warlord Guthrum led a massive army into Wessex, determined to finish what Ivar and Halfdan had started. In January 878, Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack on Chippenham, forcing King Alfred into hiding. Alfred fled to the marshlands of Athelney, where he gathered a small force of loyal warriors. At this point, most rulers would have surrendered, but Alfred refused to yield. Instead, he did something no Anglo-Saxon king had ever done before. He disappeared into the marshlands, preparing for one final stand. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, explains, "This was the lowest point for Wessex. Alfred, once a prince of a proud kingdom, was now reduced to a fugitive, living in the swamps. Yet from these swamps he would begin the fight back that saved England." In the winter of 875 AD, Alfred and a small band of loyal followers retreated into the swampy wilderness of Athelney, a remote and inhospitable region of Somerset. From here, he began a campaign of resistance, launching surprise attacks against Viking garrisons and supply lines. This period became legendary in English history, giving rise to the famous tale of Alfred and the burnt cakes, a story in which a disguised Alfred, hiding among peasants, was scolded by a woman for failing to watch over her baking bread. But behind the legend was a real strategy. Alfred rallied the remaining forces of Wessex, using the marshlands as a defensive stronghold. He built alliances with local lords, strengthening his army. He carefully planned one final battle, a last stand that would decide England's fate. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, "Alfred's time in the marshes was not just about survival. It was about transformation. The young prince who had fought at Ashdown would emerge from Athelney as a warrior king, and in 878 AD, that warrior king would march to war for the last time." Wessex had survived when all other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had fallen. Alfred, once a mere prince, had now become the last hope of England. The Vikings had pushed Wessex to the brink of extinction, but they had failed to finish the job. The final battle was coming, and at Edington, Alfred the Great would change the course of history forever. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, describes this moment as a time of absolute darkness for the Anglo-Saxons. Every kingdom of England had fallen, and now their last king was little more than a fugitive in the swamps. For the first time in history, it seemed as though England would belong to the Norse. But Alfred had not fled to surrender. He had fled to survive. From the swamps of Athelney, he began to fight back. He gathered the last remnants of his army, calling upon those who still remained loyal to Wessex. He launched guerrilla raids against Viking outposts, striking swiftly and disappearing into the marshes. He reorganized his forces, training them in new tactics that would counter the Viking shield wall. Most importantly, he spread a message of hope. He sent word throughout Wessex that the king was alive, that he had not abandoned his people, and that the fight was not yet over. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Nut the Great, writes, "The genius of Alfred was not just in his ability to survive, but in his ability to inspire. He turned a moment of absolute defeat into a rallying cry, transforming himself from a fugitive into a symbol of resistance. The time to strike back was coming." By the spring of 878 AD, Alfred had gathered a small but determined army. Unlike the fractured forces that had been so easily crushed at Chippenham, these warriors were battle-hardened survivors, men who had lost everything to the Vikings and had nothing left to lose. In May 878, Alfred marched out of Athelney. He moved toward the Viking-occupied lands, spreading word that the Saxons would make one last stand. His army swelled as farmers, exiles and warriors joined him, drawn by his vision of resistance. Eleanor Parker in Dragon Lords describes this moment as Alfred had become something more than a king. He had become a legend, the last hope of the Anglo-Saxon world, the man who would either reclaim his kingdom or die in the attempt. The final battle was coming. The battlefield would be Edington, and if Alfred failed here, Wessex would cease to exist. This brings us to the end of part 2. We've followed the Vikings from their earliest raids to the rise of the Great Heathen Army and the struggle for survival in Anglo-Saxon England. But the story is far from over. In part 3, coming next Sunday, we'll explore the legendary Battle of Edington, uncover how the Danelaw was born, and trace the final chapters of the Viking era in England. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next chapter.